On a quiet road in Surrey, in the summer of 1921, around 60 men dragged a coachload of bookmakers into the dirt and set about them with hatchets, hammers, and house bricks. The attackers were certain they had just crushed their greatest enemy. They were wrong. They had savaged the wrong men entirely, and 23 of them would vanish into prison for it. Most people believe the most savage gang war in London's history belonged to the Cray twins. It did not. Decades before the Crays were even born, a longer and far more brutal war was fought across the racecourses of England, and it was fought over something that sounds almost laughable today: chalk, wooden stools, and the right to stand beside a bookmaker. This is the story of how a fortune in untaxed cash turned ordinary racetracks into battlefields, how two ruthless gangs dressed extortion up as a respectable business, and how they defeated the justice system itself by making certain that no frightened witness ever dared to speak. Section 1. The easiest money in England. When the First World War ended in 1918, a tired and grieving country went looking for something that felt like life again. Men came home from the trenches with back pay in their pockets and a deep need to enjoy themselves. They wanted noise and crowds, a drink, and the small electric thrill of betting on something. And across England, one place handed them all of that at once: the racecourse. By the early 1920s, the big meetings were busier than anyone had ever seen. Tens of thousands of people poured through the gates at Epsom, Ascot, Brighton, and Newmarket. They arrived by train, by open-topped coach, and on foot, and most of them came to have a flutter. There was also a quiet legal reason the track pulled in such enormous crowds. Away from the racecourse, placing a cash bet was against the law for the ordinary working man. The track was the one place he could legally hand over real money in person and back a horse. So the racecourse was not just entertainment. For millions of people, it was the only door into betting that the law left open, and they crowded through it. The man at the centre of all this was the bookmaker. Picture him standing on a wooden stool at the edge of the track, a board of chalked odds propped in front of him, and a worn leather satchel hanging at his side. That satchel filled up quickly. The amount of cash moving across a busy course in a single afternoon was staggering, and the men who later learned to skim from this trade could pull in as much as £5,000 from one big meeting in a day. To put that in plain terms, an ordinary factory worker at the time might bring home only a few pounds a week. £5,000 in an afternoon was more than most working men would earn in 20 years. Here is the obvious problem with a bag full of cash standing in an open field. Everyone can see it. Even before the war, the trackside had become a feeding ground for the idle and the dangerous. A bookmaker setting up his spot might be approached by some local tough who simply fancied a cut of the takings. Refuse him, and you risked being roughed up in front of your own customers, which was bad for trade and worse for the nerves. Some bookmakers became so worried that they hired their own minders just to get through the day. The whole thing was messy and unpredictable. Nobody was really in charge, and the money lay there for the taking. Then somebody got organised. The first men to turn this chaos into a proper business came out of Birmingham. People called them the Birmingham Boys, or sometimes the Brummagem Boys, after the old nickname for the city. Their leader was a clever, hard-headed operator named Billy Kimber. By around 1910, Kimber had gathered a loose army of fighters, pickpockets, and street men, and by the end of the war, he had worked something out that would make him rich. The real money at the races was not in placing bets. It was in controlling the men who took them. Kimber's method was simple, and most of the time, it spread fear without a single blow being thrown. His men did not just walk up and demand cash for nothing. That was crude, and crude things got reported to the police. Instead, they sold the bookmaker things he could not trade without, and they set the prices themselves. Think about what a bookmaker actually needed to do his job. He needed a good position near the action, what they called a pitch. He needed a stool so the crowd could spot him.
Needed chalk to write his odds, a bucket of water and a wet sponge to wipe the board clean every time the prices changed, and a printed list of the runners for each race.
None of these things were worth much on their own, but the Birmingham boys made themselves the only suppliers, and they made certain the bookmaker bought from them and from nobody else. A runner list that cost pennies to print would be pressed on a bookmaker for many times its value. A stool, a lump of chalk, a place to stand, the right to wipe down a board, all of it came with a charge, and the charge was whatever Kimber's men decided. The bookmaker paid up and quietly called it the cost of doing business, because the other option was being set upon and left unable to work at all. This was the cunning of the whole scheme, and it is worth slowing down on. The Birmingham boys had taken something ugly and dressed it up as something ordinary. On the surface, a man was just buying chalk and renting a stool. Underneath, he was paying for permission to earn a living, and the day he stopped paying, he would learn fast what that so-called service had really been shielding him from. For a few years, Kimber had everything. His men ruled the richest courses in the south of England, the ones closest to London, where the crowds were thickest and the satchels heaviest. The Birmingham boys were outsiders on those southern tracks, hundreds of miles from home, yet it made no difference. They had the numbers, they had the reputation, and they had the appetite for force whenever force was needed. The smaller outfits looked at them and stepped aside. But Kimber made one decision that would come back on him hard, and it came from nothing more complicated than greed. Among the bookmakers working the southern courses was a tight-knit group of Jewish operators from the East End of London. They were skilled at their trade, and they earned well, which made them an inviting target. Kimber's men leaned on them exactly as they leaned on everyone else. Pay the charges, buy the chalk and the lists at our prices, or face the consequences. What Kimber failed to weigh up properly was that these were not lonely, frightened men with nowhere to go. They belonged to a community with deep roots in London, and that community had its own links to people who knew how to deal with trouble. The East End bookmakers grew sick of handing their hard-won earnings to a crew from Birmingham. Among themselves, they began to turn over a different idea. What if they stopped paying outsiders for protection and found protection of their own? Protection that actually belonged to London. One name kept surfacing in those quiet conversations, a name from the narrow streets of Clerkenwell, the Italian quarter known as Little Italy, where a local strongman had built a name for himself as someone who looked after his own people. He was not famous yet. He was not yet feared across the country. That was about to change. The men of the East End were preparing to make an introduction that would turn a quiet protection racket into the longest and most savage gang war the capital had ever known. And the man they were about to invite to the table would spend the next 15 years teaching Billy Kimber that he had walked into the wrong city to take his money from. Section 2. The Man from Little Italy. To understand the man the East End bookmakers turned to, you have to walk a few streets north of the City of London, into a cramped corner of Clerkenwell that everyone simply called Little Italy. This was a tight, busy neighbourhood of Italian families who had crossed Europe to find work in London, packed together in narrow streets around Saffron Hill, scraping a living as street sellers, knife grinders, ice cream makers, and labourers. Money was short, and tempers could be shorter. It was here, in 1888, that the future king of the racecourse gangs was born. His name is one of the first puzzles of his whole story. History remembers him as Charles Darby Sabini, but even that is not solid ground. His name turns up in different forms across different official records, and years later, when police questioned him, he himself insisted that his real name was not Charles at all, but Ottavio. He was the son of an Italian father and an English mother, and the exact details of his birth are tangled in the paperwork of the period. What is certain is that he grew up poor, surrounded by the Italian community he would one day claim to protect, and that he learned very early how to use his fists. As a young man, Sabini had a real gift for fighting. People who watched him reckoned he could have become a proper boxer, but he had no patience for the dull, punishing routine of training. So instead of chasing a career in the ring, he put those fists to work as a bouncer, minding the doors at a boxing venue over in Hoxton. It was steady money for a strong young man with a temper he could switch on the moment he needed it. The moment that made his local name came in 1920 in a pub called the Griffin in Saffron Hill. As the story is told, a well-known heavy who worked for a South London crew insulted an Italian barmaid. Sabini stepped in and knocked the man out cold. To the people of Little Italy, that was not just a pub scrap. It was proof that here, finally, was one of their own who could stand up to the rough outsiders and win. From that day, Sabini carried a reputation as a protector, a man who looked after Italians and would not sit quiet while a woman was disrespected. That reputation matters because it explains why people trusted him. Within his own community, Sabini was not viewed as a common street tough. He was viewed as a guardian. And a guardian was exactly what the frightened bookmakers of the East End were so desperately looking for. The connection was made through a man named Edward Emanuel, a heavyweight figure in the Jewish underworld of the East End. The harassed bookmakers, worn down by paying the Birmingham boys just for the right to do their jobs, took their problem to Emanuel. Emanuel in turn brought in Sabini and his Italian followers. The arrangement was plain. The Italians would shield the East End bookmakers from Kimber's men, and in return they would take a slice of the earnings. This was the spark. With a single introduction, Billy Kimber suddenly had a genuine rival, one rooted in London itself, with a loyal following and a whole community ready to close ranks around him. The dispute stopped being about chalk and stools. It became about who owned the south of England. Sabini built his organisation quickly. His own outfit, often called the Italian Mob, grew into something far bigger than a few handy street fighters. At its peak, it was said to number in the hundreds. More importantly, Sabini grasped a truth that Kimber had relied on for years. You do not win these wars with the toughest single man. You win them with the most men. So Sabini stitched together an alliance. He joined with the Jewish gang run by Alf Solomon, the same muscle that had grown out of the bookmakers' troubles in the first place. He brought in Alf White and his crew based around King's Cross. Between them, these groups could put a small army onto a racecourse or into a London street at almost no notice. The southern tracks were no longer Kimber's private property, and everyone trading on them knew it. Kimber was not the folding type. Faced with this new London alliance, he assembled one of his own. He bound his Birmingham gang to the Elephant and Castle crew from south of the river, the Camden town men under George Sage, and the Finsbury fighters led by Freddie Gilbert. Two coalitions now stared at each other across the racecourses of England, each a patchwork of smaller gangs held together by cash and the promise of more. The way Sabini ran his half of the business showed how shrewd he really was. He did not simply scare off the Birmingham boys and copy their old racket. He seized the best pitches on every course, the prime positions where the biggest bookmakers wanted to stand, holding 5 or 6 of them at each major meeting. His men guarded the bookmakers who paid, and the terms were savage in their simplicity. For every pound a protected bookmaker took, Sabini's side kept half. 10 shillings in the pound, week after week, course after course. The money was vast, and better still, it came in like clockwork. Sabini's followers also carried a calling card that made people think twice before crossing them. Their favoured tool was the blade, and above all, the cutthroat razor. A razor was easy to hide in a coat, easy to pass off as something an honest man might carry for shaving, and able to leave a mark that healed into a scar the victim would wear for the rest of his life. The aim was rarely to end anyone. The aim was to brand a man, to leave a message written on his face that everyone could read for years afterward. Fear like that did much of the work.
Gangs work before a hand was even raised. There was one final piece that made Sabini close to untouchable. Over the years, he built quiet links with people far above the gutter. It was said he had friends among police officers, among lawyers, even among men in positions of genuine power, the kind of contacts who could make a charge fade away or persuade a witness to suddenly remember nothing. Whether every tale about his reach was true hardly mattered. The effect was real enough. Again and again, the law would close its hand around Sabini and open it to find nothing inside. So by the early 1920s, the pieces were set on the board. On one side stood Billy Kimber, the outsider from Birmingham who had been first to turn the racecourses into a gold mine. On the other stood Darby Sabini, the hometown protector with a London alliance, a private army, and a hard reputation built one fight at a time. Both men craved the very same prize, the river of cash running through the satchels at the southern tracks, and there was simply not enough room for both of them to hold it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Two organised forces, both ready for trouble, both proud, both certain the money belonged to them by right. There was only ever going to be one way this ended, and it began not with some grand announcement of war, but with a single ambush on a quiet little track on the edge of London, where one of these two men very nearly did not walk away alive. Section 3. When the talking stopped. For a short while, the two sides circled each other without doing any real harm. There were hard looks across the racecourses, muttered threats, the odd shove in a crowd. Both Kimber and Sabini had spent years building their names on the idea that they did not actually need to fight, because everyone already knew what would happen if they did. But a reputation only holds for so long when there is this much money sitting on the table. Sooner or later, one of them was going to test the other. The test came on the 23rd of March 1921 at a small trotting track in Greenford on the western edge of London. Sabini had turned up at the track that day, and the Birmingham boys were waiting for him. They knew his face, they knew his routine, and they had decided the simplest way to settle who ran the southern courses was to corner the Italian and give him a hiding he would never forget. A group of them closed in. For most men, that would have been the end of the afternoon, and very possibly the end of a great deal more. But Sabini was carrying a revolver, a small 5-chamber pistol he had no license for. As the Birmingham men moved in, he pulled it out and fired, forcing a gap and escaping the trap they had laid. He got away, but the law had seen it. Sabini was arrested and charged with firing a weapon with intent to cause serious harm, a heavy charge that could have put him away for years. This is where his cleverness and his luck first showed up in a courtroom. Sabini told the magistrates a simple story. He had been set upon by a mob, he was badly outnumbered, and he had only fired to save his own skin. He pleaded self-defense, and it worked. Instead of years behind bars, he walked out with nothing worse than a fine. The man about to sit at the center of the most savage gang war the capital had ever seen had drawn a weapon in public, used it, and paid a few pounds for the privilege. Greenford told both sides the same thing. The polite phase was finished. Within days, the trouble came roaring straight back the other way. On the 27th of March, just 4 days later, Billy Kimber turned up at Sabini's flat near King's Cross. Exactly why he went there has never been settled. Some say he came to talk peace, to find some deal that would let both men earn without tearing each other to pieces. Others say he came looking for a fight. Whatever the truth, the visit ended with Kimber being found badly hurt outside, wounded by a pistol and beaten down. By every rule of the underworld, he should not have lasted the night. Somehow he pulled through. The man widely suspected of wounding him was Alf Solomon, the same East End figure who had tied his fortunes to Sabini. Solomon was eventually brought before a court over the affair, but the case crumbled the way so many of these cases did. The jury accepted that the firearm had gone off by accident, and Solomon walked free. Nobody was ever truly held to account for nearly finishing off the most powerful gang leader in the country. Stop and think about what those 4 days in March had produced. The leader of one side had fired a weapon into a crowd of his enemies and paid a small fine. The leader of the other had been left for ruined on a London street, and the man who did it had gone unpunished. Two of the hardest figures in England had each tried to end the other inside a single week, and the law had managed to pin nothing on either of them. To everyone watching from the streets, the lesson could not have been clearer. Out here, the ordinary rules simply did not apply. After King's Cross, the attacks settled into a steady, ugly rhythm, each one answering the one before it. In April, word reached the police that the Birmingham side was planning revenge. Officers rushed to the spot, but by the time they got there, the harm was already done. All they found were 2 Birmingham bookmakers who had been worked over and left in a sorry state. Before long, it was the other side's turn. 2 men who drove cars for Sabini, both from the Jewish community backing him, were ambushed on the road. One of them was wounded twice by a pistol. When the police asked who was responsible, the drivers gave the answer everyone in this world always gave. They had seen nothing. They could not name a soul. That silence was a weapon all of its own. People who spoke up tended to suffer terrible accidents soon after, so people learned to keep their mouths shut. It meant that even when officers caught a case almost in the act, they often could not make it hold, because the only ones who knew the truth were far too afraid to repeat it in front of a judge. The gangs were not merely fighting each other, they were quietly beating the justice system itself, case by collapsed case. The cycle kept turning all through the spring, and it grew nastier as it went. The most striking attack of the lot came on the night before that year's running of the Derby at Epsom, the single biggest day in the whole English racing calendar. One of the Birmingham men was set upon in Covent Garden, right in the heart of London. The assault was so ferocious that surgeons needed 70 stitches to put him back together. 70 stitches is not a warning shot across the bows. It is an effort to take a man apart. The timing was chosen with care. The Derby pulled in the largest crowds and the fattest satchels of the entire year, which made it the richest prize either side could dream of seizing. Carving up a Birmingham man the night before that meeting was a message fired straight at Kimber. It told him his people were not safe even in the centre of the capital, and it dared him to show his face at Epsom the next morning. By now the newspapers had woken up. Reporters who had once treated these men as a faraway curiosity began writing about open warfare on the streets and racecourses of England, about armed mobs and brutal attacks happening in daylight in front of ordinary families out for a day at the races. To the press, it looked like razors, blades and pistols spilling into public life. The public grew uneasy. The pressure on the police to act started to climb, and still the cash kept pouring in, which meant neither side had the smallest reason to stand down. Everything up to this point had been a string of separate clashes, one ambush trading off against another. But all of it had been quietly building toward a single collision, a day when the two armies would finally meet out in the open, in numbers, with their tools in their hands. That day was almost here, and it was coming at Epsom. What unfolded on a quiet stretch of road near the racecourse would become the most notorious event of the entire war. A scene so shocking it would flood the courts, gut the Birmingham ranks, and tip the balance of power in a single afternoon. And the strangest, cruelest part of it all is that the men torn apart that day were not even the enemy their attackers believed they were. Section 4. The Wrong Men. The Derby meeting at Epsom in the early summer of 1921 was the prize both sides had been circling for months. It was the busiest week of the racing year, the moment when the largest crowds and the heaviest satchels of cash all gathered in one place. If you wanted to prove who truly controlled the southern courses, this was the stage to do it on. The Birmingham boys arrived looking for a fight. They had hired a charabanc, a long, open-topped motor coach painted a bright, eye-catching blue, and they filled it with their hardest men. The plan, as far as anyone can piece it together, was to find Sabini's people at the course and settle the whole matter once and for all. When they reached Epsom, though, they ran into a problem. Sabini's Italian mob had turned out in numbers exactly as expected. The trouble was that the police had turned out too. The flying squad, the specialist unit created to chase precisely this sort of organised crime, was there in force under a determined detective inspector named Stevens. Kicking off a brawl in front of that many officers would only end with the Birmingham men in the cells. So they changed the plan. Rather than fight at the racecourse, the Birmingham boys slipped away early and set a trap on the route home. A few miles from Epsom, near the village of Ewell in Surrey, they pulled their bright blue charabanc off the road and tucked it behind some bushes on the London road, close to an old beer house. They parked one of their men in a car in a side turning nearby and gave him a simple job: watch the road and give the signal when the enemy came past. Anyone driving back to London from the races would have to pass this exact spot. It was a perfect place for an ambush. Then they waited. After a while, the lookout spotted a vehicle coming, a sturdy motor of the type they called a tender, and the word went round that the enemy was on the way. The Birmingham men swung their own car across the road to block it. With a car in front and a wall of attackers closing in behind, the people in the tender had nowhere to run. Between 50 and 60 men swarmed the vehicle, hauled the occupants out, and set about them with everything they had brought along: hatchets, hammers, iron bars, house bricks, and blades. The assault was brutal even by the standards of these men. Arms were broken, heads were split open. The occupants were beaten until they stopped moving, then left lying in the road as the Birmingham boys sprinted back to their charabanc and roared off toward London, convinced they had just landed a crushing blow on Derby Sabini. They had done nothing of the sort. The men they had torn apart were not Sabini's fighters at all. They were a group of bookmakers from Leeds. The Birmingham gang had got it into their heads that these Leeds men had switched sides and thrown in with Sabini, and in the heat and confusion they fell on them, believing the enemy was inside that vehicle. Instead, they had crippled a coachload of ordinary bookmakers who had never raised a hand against them. It was a disaster built out of suspicion, rumour, and temper, and it would cost the Birmingham boys far more than it ever cost Sabini, who was not even on the scene. What came next would almost be funny, if you could forget the broken bodies left in the road. A garbled report reached the Epsom police that there had been a riot of some kind out at Ewell, with wild early rumours even suggesting it was political trouble. Detective Inspector Stevens forced his way through the home-going crowds and made for the scene, where even a hardened officer was sickened by the state of the injured bookmakers. He sent out a message to every police station in the area, describing the attackers, and above all, their unmistakable bright blue charabanc. You cannot hide a vehicle like that. A coach full of rough men in a coach that colour might as well have driven around carrying a banner. Before long, a constable named Shoesmith spotted it parked outside a pub on Kingston Hill near Richmond Park. He called it in, and a police sergeant named Merritt hurried over. To make certain the gang could not simply leap aboard and escape, Merritt lifted the bonnet of the charabanc and ripped the leads clean off the sparking plugs, leaving the engine useless and the Birmingham boys stranded on the spot. When officers searched the coach, they found all the proof they could ever need. Inside lay a loaded pistol, choppers, large stones and hammers, one of them with a handle split clean through from the sheer force it had been swung. The floor was a litter of broken glass, and worse. No innocent man kits out a motor coach like that. The arrests came fast. Around 28 men were taken in over the ambush, and the case went before the courts at Guildford. In the end, 23 of them were convicted and handed sentences running from 9 months up to 3. Years of hard prison time. In one single afternoon, a huge slice of Billy Kimber's London and Birmingham muscle had been scooped off the streets and shut away. One of the men said to have helped lead the ambush was Wag MacDonald, a major figure in Kimber's London alliance. Facing arrest with the rest of them, MacDonald did not hang around for the knock at the door. He fled the country entirely, eventually crossing the Atlantic to the United States. In one of the strangest turns in the whole story, this London gang fighter is said to have ended up in Los Angeles, working as a bodyguard to the silent film star and comedian Charlie Chaplin. A man who had helped wreck a coach of bookmakers on a quiet Surrey road one summer was, not long after, minding one of the most famous faces on the planet. For Kimber, the Epsom ambush was a catastrophe wearing the costume of a victory. He had set out to show his strength, and instead handed Sabini a gift. His men had attacked the wrong targets, packed the prisons with his best fighters, and left his organisation badly weakened, all without Sabini risking a single one of his own. With so many Birmingham boys behind bars, the southern racecourses suddenly had a great deal more elbow room on them, and only one man was sitting in the right place to fill it. The newspapers seized on the whole affair, and the public was shaken by it. Until now, much of the trouble had been brushed off as villains harming other villains, a private squabble that decent people could ignore. But here were ordinary bookmakers left broken, in a country road, in front of horrified witnesses, in daylight, during the most famous race meeting in England. The image stuck. From this point on, the racecourse gangs were no longer a distant rumour. They were a national problem that everyone could picture. Darby Sabini did not need to win the fight at Ewell. He simply needed his enemy to lose it for him. And that is precisely what occurred. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With the Birmingham ranks thinned and their leader reeling, Sabini moved quickly to lock in his advantage. But holding the racecourses by brute force was costly and dangerous, and it kept dragging his men in front of judges. What Sabini really wanted was something cleaner, something that let him take his cut while looking almost respectable. The solution he landed on would dress his street gang up as a proper business, and it would tighten his grip on the tracks like nothing before it. Section 5. The Respectable Racket. Winning by force had a serious flaw, and Darby Sabini was smart enough to see it. Every time his men settled a dispute with hatchets and blades, somebody ended up in front of a judge. The Epsom ambush had just shown the whole country what happened when a gang went too far in the open. 23 men had vanished into prison in one go. Sabini did not want to spend the next 10 years bailing out fighters and recruiting replacements. He wanted the money without the prison sentences. He wanted his racket to look like a business. And the strange thing is, the bookmakers themselves were about to hand him the perfect way to do it. By 1921, the men who stood at the tracks with their satchels were exhausted and frightened. For years they had been squeezed from every direction, first by the Birmingham boys, then by the Italian mob, then by every small crew that fancied a cut. The harassment had grown worse, not better. It was no longer just a matter of losing a few pounds. In at least one case, a bookmaker was threatened with a pistol and told to pay up or face the consequences. The gangs had moved on from threatening a man's living to threatening the man himself. The bookmakers wanted protection, and they wanted order. The racing authorities could not give it to them. The police could only turn up after the damage was done, and even then, they could rarely make a charge stick because nobody would speak. So the bookmakers decided to organize themselves. In August 1921, just weeks after the carnage at Ewell, they set up a body with a long and very respectable name: the Racecourse Bookmakers and Backers Protection Association. Its first president was a man named Walter Beresford. On paper, the idea was sensible and even admirable. Here was an official organization that would look after bookmakers, sort out the endless squabbles over who stood where, and bring some calm to the chaos of the betting ring. But there was a rotten heart inside this clean-looking idea. The association could not actually keep anyone safe on its own. It had no real power to stop a gang of armed men, so it did the only thing it could. It turned to the strongest gang on the racecourses and effectively put them on the payroll. The muscle that had been menacing the bookmakers was now hired to protect them, and the man taken on as one of the association's salaried stewards was none other than Darby Sabini himself. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the cleverest move in the whole story. The bookmakers were now paying Sabini money, willingly, through an official organisation to shield them from the very violence that Sabini and his allies had been dishing out. The protection racket had not ended. It had simply been given a respectable name, a president, and a set of account books. To the outside world, it looked like a trade association employing stewards to keep order. Underneath, it was the same old shakedown, just wearing a suit. It got murkier still. The association's own vice president was himself a well-known figure from the underworld. So the body that was supposed to rescue honest bookmakers from criminals was, at the top, partly run by criminals. The line between the protectors and the predators had not just blurred, it had been rubbed out completely. As stewards, Sabini's men now controlled the things every bookmaker needed. They decided who got the best pitches, the prime spots near the action. They supplied the printed lists of runners, the chalk, the water and the stools, and they set the prices. A bookmaker who paid his dues and bought his services got a good position and a quiet day. A bookmaker who argued found himself shoved to a useless corner of the course, or worse. The same old levers, now pulled by men with official titles. This was close to the perfect crime, because it was so hard to call it a crime at all. How do you prosecute a man for being a steward of a recognized association? How do you charge him with taking money that bookmakers were handing over by agreement? When the police looked at it, they saw paperwork and signatures and a legitimate-sounding body. When the bookmakers looked at it, they saw the men who could hurt them. Both things were true at once, and that was exactly the point. Sabini's quiet connections made it even safer for him. With friends rumoured among police, lawyers and people of influence, he could rely on cases falling apart and questions going unasked. The association gave him the cover of respectability, and his contacts made sure that cover was rarely tested. For a man who had been firing a pistol on a trotting track only months earlier, it was a remarkable change of costume. For a while, this arrangement printed money for the Sabini side. It was steady, it was enormous, and best of all, it carried almost no risk of prison. No charabanc full of choppers, no ambushes on country roads, just a steady stream of cash flowing in from bookmakers across the south of England, collected under an official banner that the law found very difficult to touch. But greed has a way of wrecking even the cleverest schemes. The stewards were not content with their generous cut. Before long, Sabini's men began inventing extra charges of their own, demanding sums that even the association had never agreed to. They were skimming from the skim. It became so blatant that the association itself eventually had to cut its ties with these stewards and their questionable services, because the men hired to bring order were now openly fleecing the very people who employed them. In time, a judge looking at the mess would remark that the sooner this association was dissolved, the better. The respectable name had only ever been a thin coat of paint, and the paint was already peeling. Here is the most important truth about the association, though. For all its clever paperwork, it did not bring peace. It could not. The deeper problem had never gone away. There was still a fortune sitting at the racecourses, there were still hungry gangs who wanted it, and there were still old scores left unsettled from the battles of 1921. Dressing the racket up in a respectable name did nothing to cool the hatred between the men involved. It simply gave them a brief, uneasy quiet while the money came in. That quiet was never going to hold. The Sabini camp was a patchwork of hard men with their own ambitions, and the defeated Birmingham side and its London allies had not forgiven a single thing. The tension was still there, coiled tight, waiting for one spark to set it off again. The spark came in Camden. One ordinary evening outside a London pub called the Southampton Arms, the war that the association had supposedly tamed came screaming back into the open, with pistols drawn in a public street. And this time, two of the most senior names on Sabini's side would find that even his famous luck with the courts had its limits. Section 6. The Reckoning in Camden. The association had handed Sabini a respectable mask, but the face behind it had not changed in the slightest. He still had enemies, and those enemies still wanted him finished. The men he had beaten back in 1921 had not given up. They had simply been pushed into a corner, and they were biding their time, waiting for the chance to come forward again. A coat of fresh paint over a rotten beam does not make the beam any stronger. Sooner or later, it gives way. To understand what happened in Camden, you have to remember who was still standing on the other side. When Kimber had built his alliance against Sabini, two of his most important London partners were a man named George Sage, who ran the Camden Town Crew, and a man named Freddie Gilbert, who led the Finsbury Fighters. These were not small-time names. They were commanders, the sort of men who could summon fighters of their own and make real trouble. While Sage and Gilbert were free and active, the rival alliance still had a backbone. Remove them from the picture, and that backbone would snap. The Sabini side decided to do precisely that. One evening in 1922, outside a London pub called the Southampton Arms in the Camden area, the two sides collided in the worst possible way. Pistols were produced in a public street, and George Sage and Freddie Gilbert were fired upon and wounded. This was not a wild racecourse brawl out in the countryside. This was gunfire on a city street, in a busy stretch of London where ordinary families lived, drank, and walked home in the evening. The war had stepped off the racecourses and into the neighbourhoods, and now anyone nearby could be caught up in it. That was a frightening shift. People had grown used to reading about villains harming other villains far away at the races. Hearing that pistols were being fired outside a local pub on a street much like their own was something else entirely. It made the danger feel close, and it pushed the public mood further against the gangs than ever before. When the police worked out who was behind the attack, the names they settled on were striking. One was Joseph Sabini, one of Darby's own brothers. The other was Alf White, the King's Cross leader who had thrown in with the Sabinis years earlier. And here is the detail that almost beggars belief. The police described Alf White as the association's chief steward. The man whose official duty was to keep order on the racecourses, the supposedly respectable face of bookmaker protection, now stood accused of firing on rivals in a Camden street. The respectable mask had slipped right off. Anyone who still wanted to believe the association was an honest body now had to explain why its chief steward was being charged over a street attack with pistols. What followed in court was, for once, a real setback for the Sabini camp. Normally these cases melted into nothing. Witnesses forgot what they had seen. Evidence went astray. Juries threw up their hands. But this time, even though a key witness disappeared before the trial, the case held together well enough to produce a verdict. Both men were convicted. Alf White was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Joseph Sabini was given 3. For a brief, surprising moment, it looked as though the law had finally drawn a firm line. 2 senior men were going to prison, including the so-called chief steward and a member of the Sabini family itself. The judge, Mr. Justice Roach, used the occasion to say out loud what plenty of people had been quietly thinking. He remarked that the sooner this association was dissolved, the better. A judge on the bench had effectively branded the body that claimed to protect bookmakers as a menace that ought to be shut down. It was a public humiliation for the entire scheme. But this is where the story turns, and where you see just how much real power these men held. Sending them to prison was one thing. Keeping them there was another thing entirely. The Sabini side could not rewrite a verdict, but they could go to work on the people whose words had produced it, and the pressure they could bring to bear on a nervous witness was crushing. When Alf White's case came up on appeal, something decisive happened. George Sage's own wife, who had given evidence, withdrew it. Whatever she had said before, she would no longer stand behind it. Without her testimony, the case against White came apart, and he walked free. 5 years simply dissolved into nothing. The man convicted over a street attack with pistols was back out on the pavement, and the verdict that had briefly looked like justice was quietly unpicked. We will never know exactly what passed between the gang and the people who could have kept White behind bars, but the pattern is impossible to miss. Again and again in this war, the law would get close, sometimes painfully close, only for the case to fall apart at the final hurdle as a witness lost their nerve or changed their tune. The gangs had learned a simple lesson. You did not need to outwit the courts. You only needed to reach the small number of ordinary people whose word the courts relied on and frighten them into silence. This is the quiet horror running beneath the whole story. The hatchets and the pistols grabbed the headlines, but the deeper harm was being done to something far less dramatic. The simple belief that if you witnessed a crime, you could safely tell the truth about it and trust the system to handle the rest. In the world the racecourse gangs had built, telling the truth could wreck your life. So people stopped telling it, and the gangs grew a little stronger every time they did. The Camden attack settled something all the same, even though the convictions did not hold. It showed both sides that the feud was now personal and aimed straight at the top. Leaders were fair game. Family members were fair game. The fight was no longer only about who collected money from which bookmaker. It had turned into a contest about who could survive it, and who would still be on his feet when the dust finally settled. And yet, for all the danger still simmering in Kimber's battered alliance, the gravest threat to Derby Sabini was not going to arrive from the Birmingham side, or from Sage, or from Gilbert. It was not going to come from any outside enemy at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It was going to come from inside his own camp, from men who spoke his language, who walked the same Clerkenwell streets, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him against the outsiders. They believed they had been cheated out of their fair share of all that easy money, and their resentment had been curdling quietly for a long time. Before the year was out, that resentment would erupt inside a small social club in the heart of Little Italy, and one of the Sabini brothers would be left fighting for his life on the floor. Section 7. Betrayal in Little Italy. The greatest danger to Derby Sabini did not wear the colours of Birmingham. It came from a family that, on paper, should have been his closest kind of ally. The Cortesi brothers were Italians, like him. They had grown up in the same crowded streets of Clerkenwell, in the same tight community of immigrant families. For a time, they had stood on the same side as the Sabinis against the outsiders. And that is exactly what made them so dangerous, because they knew Sabini, they knew his methods, and they knew how the money really moved. There were 4 Cortesi brothers, Gus, Enrico, Paul, and George, along with a trusted lieutenant named Alexander Tommaso, who went by the nickname Sandy Rice. The family had an unusual history. Their parents were Italian, but the brothers had actually been born in Paris before their mother brought them across to England as children. By the early years of the century, they had settled in the heart of Little Italy, and like so many young men in that world, they drifted into the business of squeezing money out of gamblers and bookmakers. For a while, the Cortesis and the Sabinis worked the same side of the street. But money has a way of poisoning even the closest bonds, and the Cortesi brothers came to believe they were being short-changed. They felt they were doing the work and taking the risks without seeing a fair slice of the profits from the bookmaking and the West End gambling clubs. That sense of being cheated festered. Resentment turned into anger, and anger turned into a decision. The Cortesis broke with the Sabinis and threw in their lot with Freddie Gilbert's Finsbury crew, one of the gangs aligned against Derby. The tension boiled over even before the night everyone remembers. At one point, inside a Clerkenwell social club, Harry Sabini, one of Derby's brothers, learned that the Cortesis had joined the other side. In the row that followed, Harry pulled out a revolver and pointed it at them. Nobody was harmed that day, but a line had been crossed. Once one brother has aimed a weapon at another man across a table, there is no walking it back. Everyone in that room knew there would be a reckoning. It came on the 20th of November 1922 at the Fratellanza Social Club, a small members' club on Great Bath Street in Clerkenwell. Derby and Harry Sabini went to the club that night, and the likeliest reason is that they came to talk peace, to find some way to cool the feud before it turned deadly. Inside, 3 women were sitting at a table. The rest of the room held the 4 Cortesi brothers and Sandy Rice. One of the women was a young woman named Louisa Dorali, the daughter of the club's secretary, and she happened to be Derby Sabini's goddaughter. Remember her, because in the next few minutes she does something extraordinary. Whatever hope there had been of a calm conversation died almost at once. Words were traded, voices rose, and the old hatred came flooding back. Then Paul Cortesi threw a cup of scalding coffee into Harry Sabini's face, and the room erupted into a brawl. This time, it was the Cortesis who came armed. Gus Cortesi pulled out a revolver and aimed it straight at Darby Sabini, the prize target, the head of the whole organisation. At that range, he could hardly miss. And here is where Louisa de Raleigh changed the course of the night. She knocked his arm aside just as the weapon fired. Instead of striking Darby, the shot flew wide and punched a hole through a window. A young woman, with her bare hands, had just saved the most powerful gang leader in the country from being finished where he stood. Darby was not out of danger. As the chaos spread, Sandy Rice swung a heavy bottle and cracked it down on him, knocking him to the floor. But the worst of it fell on Harry. As Enrico Cortese turned his weapon on Harry Sabini, Louisa de Raleigh threw herself in front of Harry to shield him with her own body. It was a stunning act of courage from someone who had no reason to be in the middle of a gang fight at all. Harry, perhaps trying to protect her, pushed her out of the way, and in doing so left himself exposed. Enrico fired, and Harry was wounded in the stomach. For a moment, it looked as though the Corteses had done what the Birmingham boys never managed. They had drawn Sabini blood inside his own territory, in front of witnesses, and left one of the brothers badly hurt on the floor of a club in the middle of Little Italy. What happened next showed something uncomfortable about Sabini's grip on his own community. When the police went to arrest the Cortese brothers at their homes, they were blocked. A large crowd of local Anglo-Italian people gathered and got in the way, making it impossible for the officers to take the men in. This was supposed to be Sabini country, where Darby was the beloved protector. Yet here were his own neighbours shielding the men who had just tried to end his brother. It suggested that plenty of people in Little Italy were not as loyal to the Sabinis as the legend claimed, and that some of them quietly preferred the Corteses. In the end, the brothers gave themselves up. The case went to court, and the result was strangely mild for a fight that had left a man with a wound to the stomach. Gus and Enrico Cortese were convicted of attempting to take a life and sentenced to 3 years each. The other 2 brothers and Sandy Rice were cleared of assault and walked free. The judge reserved his real admiration for one person in that courtroom, and it was not a gangster. He praised Louisa de Raleigh for her bravery, and rightly so. She had deflected one attack and tried to absorb another, and she had very probably kept both Sabini brothers alive. Yet she remains one of the great mysteries of the whole story. She seems to have given her evidence under a false name, and beyond the newspaper reports of the fight, she barely appears in any records at all. The young woman who saved the king of the racecourse gangs simply slips out of history, and nobody can say for certain who she really was or what became of her. Harry Sabini recovered from his wound and lived on. The feud with the Corteses burned out after the trial, their challenge broken. But the night at the Fratellanza Club had revealed something important. Sabini was not invincible, and he was not universally loved. His greatest danger had come from men of his own background, and he had survived only because of the quick hands of a brave young woman, not because of his army or his connections. Through everything so far, the ambushes on country roads, the firing in the Camden street, the brawl in the Clerkenwell Club, one line had somehow not been crossed in the records that survive. For all the wounds and broken bones and scars, the war had not yet produced a confirmed death. That dark distinction was still waiting to be claimed. And before long, inside a London club, one of Sabini's own most trusted men would finally cross it, taking a life in a way that would put him on trial for his own. Section 8. The line is crossed. For years, the racecourse war had been astonishingly lucky in one grim respect. Men had been beaten, scarred, wounded by pistols and laid out in the road, yet somehow they had kept surviving. Kimber lived. Harry Sabini lived. The Leeds bookmakers, broken as they were, lived. That luck finally ran out in the autumn of 1924, inside a London club, and the man who ended it was not a Birmingham enemy. He was one of Sabini's own most trusted fighters. His name was Alfred Solomon, and you have met him before in this story. Solomon was the East End figure who had thrown in with Sabini at the very start, and he was the man widely believed to have wounded Billy Kimber outside that King's Cross flat back in 1921. He had been at the centre of the violence from the beginning. Now he would be at the centre of its first confirmed death. The man who lost his life was a bookmaker named Barnet Blitz, known to many as Barney. Like Solomon, Blitz moved in the same tangled world of bookmaking and racecourse money. This was not a clash between two enemy armies. It was a falling out between men who operated on the same side of the betting business, which tells you something important about this war. By 1924, it was no longer only about Sabini against Birmingham. The money had drawn in so many hard, greedy men that they had begun turning on each other, even within the same camp. The bad blood between Solomon and Blitz had roots in the racecourse trade. There had been some quarrel between Blitz and the people around Edward Emmanuel, going back to a spring race meeting at Epsom, the kind of business dispute that simmered for months. Blitz had been muscling into selling betting lists, the very lists the gangs guarded so jealously, and he had a reputation as a difficult, aggressive character. Whatever the precise cause, by the night they met at the club, there was real hatred in the air. It happened on the 23rd of September 1924 at a place called the Eden Club on the Hampstead Road in London. According to the account that Solomon's side would later put forward, the trouble began with Blitz. They claimed Blitz attacked Solomon first, striking him a heavy blow with a glass or a bottle, hard enough to leave Solomon dazed and, as the defense would put it, beyond reason. What is not in dispute is what Solomon did next. He moved across that room in an instant and struck Blitz in the neck with a blade. The wound was catastrophic, and Barnet Blitz did not survive it. The reaction in the club says everything about the kind of people who filled these places. As a man lay dying, the other customers did not rush to help him. They rushed for the exit. Witnesses later described people fleeing the club in such a panic that some of them left without their hats and coats, desperate only to be far away before the police arrived and before anyone could later say they had been there. In this world, being a witness was the most dangerous thing you could possibly become. When the case came to court, it drew enormous attention. The trial was held at the Old Bailey, the most famous criminal court in the country, before a judge named Mr. Justice Salter. The public seats were packed with people eager to see how it would end. A bookmaker was dead, a known gang figure stood accused, and the whole grimy world of the racecourse rackets was suddenly on display in open court. This is the moment where Sabini's true power showed itself, not with hatchets or pistols, but with money and influence. Sabini reached out and arranged for Solomon to be defended by Sir Edward Marshall Hall, the most celebrated barrister in all of England, a man so brilliant in front of a jury that he was known across the country as the Great Defender. Ordinary villains did not get lawyers like that. Marshall Hall was the sort of advocate who defended the wealthy and the famous. Sabini could afford the very best, and he spent it to protect his man. The defense built its case on provocation and self-protection. The argument went that Blitz had set upon Solomon first, that Solomon had been struck a savage blow to the head, and that he had lashed out while barely in control of himself. A doctor was even called to suggest how, in the chaos of a struggle, a fatal wound might come about. It was a clever, carefully constructed story, delivered by the finest legal mind available, and it worked exactly as intended. The jury did not find Solomon guilty of the most serious charge, the deliberate taking of a life. Instead, they convicted him of the lesser offence, accepting that he had caused a death in the heat of a violent struggle, rather than through cold, planned intent. For taking a man's life, Alfred Solomon was sentenced to 3 years of hard prison time. 3 years. The same sentence the Cortesi brothers had received simply for wounding Harry Sabini. A man had lost his life on the floor of a London club, and the punishment was no greater than for a wound that healed. To anyone watching, the message was unmistakable. With enough money, the right lawyer, and witnesses too frightened to be of any use, even a death could be reduced to a few short years inside. There is a quiet, revealing footnote to all this, preserved in the official police files that still survive today. After the case, Alfred Solomon himself wrote to the authorities, complaining that he was being threatened, claiming that other criminals and even police were making his life dangerous and asking for protection. Stop and consider that. Here was one of the most feared men in this whole story, a man who had just taken a life and walked away with a light sentence, now frightened enough to beg the very system he had spent years defeating to keep him safe. It is a glimpse of the truth underneath the swagger. In this world, nobody was ever really secure. Today's untouchable winner was tomorrow's marked man, and everyone in it knew that the same blade that protected you could just as easily be turned your way. The death of Barnet Blitz marked a turning point in the mood of the whole conflict. The war had finally produced a body, and it had done so not in some grand battle between rival armies, but in a squalid quarrel between men who were supposed to be on the same side. The thing that had started as an organized business of protection and easy money was beginning to rot from the inside, eating its own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And Sabini, for all his power, all his money, all his famous connections, was beginning to feel the ground shift beneath him. He had survived the Birmingham boys, survived the Cortesis, survived a brother being shot and an ally standing trial. But the world was changing around him. Younger and hungrier men were watching the king grow older, and they were starting to wonder whether his crown might be there for the taking. Before long, one humiliating defeat near Piccadilly would show everyone that the great Derby Sabini was no longer the force he once had been. Section 9. The crown slips. Empires built on fear all share the same weakness. The moment people stop being afraid of you, everything you have built begins to fall apart. By the second half of the 1920s, the fear that had made Derby Sabini king of the racecourses was finally starting to fade. And once it cracked from every direction at once. The first cracks came from inside. The Sabini organization had always been a loose collection of hungry men, held together by nothing stronger than a steady flow of easy money. But greed makes a poor glue. As the years went by, Sabini's own followers began to grumble that their share was too small. The very same complaint that had once driven the Cortesis to turn on him. Suspicion spread through the ranks. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder now eyed each other's takings with envy. At one low point, the trouble grew so bad that even Derby himself was attacked, and his gold teeth were knocked clean out of his head. The king of the racecourses, roughed up and humiliated. It was a small, ugly moment, but it told the whole story. The respect that had protected him for years was draining away. While the inside rotted, new enemies were rising on the outside, and they were younger, hungrier, and entirely unimpressed by the old names. In 1925, one of Sabini's most senior allies, Alf White, was cornered in a gambling club in Paddington and badly beaten. The men who did it were not Birmingham boys. They were a new generation, a combination of the Elephant Boys from south of the river under a hard man called Tommy Bennerworth, and the Bethnal Green crew, led by a fighter known as Dodger Mullins. These were fresh faces with their own ambitions, and they felt no need to bow to the Sabini alliance. To them, the Sabinis were not legends to be feared. They were aging men sitting on ground worth taking. The clearest sign of the shift came in 1927 near Piccadilly, in a spot called Ham Yard. By now, Derby was easing back from the daily fighting, and his brother, Harry, was leading the Sabini men on the streets. At Ham Yard, Harry's gang collided with the Elephant Boys, now under the command of Wal MacDonald, brother of the same Wag MacDonald who had fled to America after the Epsom ambush. The clash that followed went down in history as the Battle of Ham Yard, and the Sabinis lost it. Consider what that defeat meant. For the best part of a decade, the Sabini name alone had been enough to make rivals back down. Now, in the heart of the West End, a Sabini-led force had been beaten in open battle by a rising London gang. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Once the other gangs saw that the Sabinis could be put down, far more of them were willing to try. Then the law finally got organised, and this turned out to be more dangerous to the rackets than any rival ever was. For years, the police had been close to helpless, partly because they simply did not have the bodies for the job. The famous Flying Squad, the unit created to chase organised crime, had begun life with only around a dozen detectives to cover the whole sprawling problem. But the pressure from the newspapers and the public had been building since the horrors of 1921, and in 1925, the Home Secretary himself declared that the gang's hold on the racetracks had to be broken. Under a determined officer nicknamed Nutty Sharp, the Flying Squad began showing up at more and more race meetings, making themselves a constant, unwelcome shadow wherever the gangs tried to work. The true death blow to the business, though, came not from fists or arrests, but from paperwork. In 1932, a new body was set up, the National Bookmakers Protection Association. And unlike the crooked outfits Sabini had once helped run, this one actually did what it claimed to do. It brought in a simple but devastating set of rules. From then on, a bookmaker could only hold a pitch if he was properly approved. And most important of all, a pitch could no longer be bought, sold, or passed from one man to another. That single change quietly gutted the heart of the racket. The gangs had built their fortune on controlling who stood where, on selling positions and renting out the right to trade. Strip away their power to hand out pitches, and you stripped away their main source of income. Bookmakers no longer had any reason to pay the gangs for a spot, because the gangs no longer controlled the spots. An entire empire of intimidation had rested on that one lever, and now the lever had been wrenched clean out of their hands. Sabini's personal collapse kept pace with the fall of his business, and in one case the damage was entirely his own doing. Back in 1924, Sabini had been so stung by a newspaper that branded him a gangster that he decided to take it to court for libel. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, a criminal suing a paper for printing the truth about him. The case went badly wrong. Sabini lost, and he was ordered to pay the costs, a sum of several £100s. When he failed to appear and failed to pay, the courts declared him bankrupt. The man who had skimmed a fortune off the racecourses of England had been financially ruined, and he had managed it himself, simply because he was too proud to let an insult pass. As the horse racing rackets dried up, the gangs went hunting for new ground, and many of them drifted toward the booming world of greyhound racing. The dog tracks were the latest craze, pulling in big crowds and plenty of cash, and they offered fresh chances for protection and intimidation. Althwaite, reading which way the wind was turning, quietly broke away from the Sabinis altogether and shifted his operations to the greyhound stadiums, even ending up part owner of a track. The old alliance was dissolving, each man drifting off toward his own corner. By the early 1930s, the world that had produced the Racecourse War was almost gone. Billy Kimber, the Birmingham boss who had started it all by reaching south for the easy money, had long since lost his grip and faded from the scene, eventually leaving the country altogether. The Birmingham boys were a spent force. Sabini was bankrupt and aging, his gang fractured, his menace broken, his income choked off by a few lines in a rulebook. The great two-sided war between Birmingham and the Italian mob, the war that had crammed the courts and filled the front pages for 10 years, did not end in one final, glorious showdown. It simply wore itself out, ground down by greed, by hungry young rivals, by the patient work of the police, and by the slow, unstoppable force of plain regulation. But the violence was not quite finished. The men of this world had never learned any other way to settle their scores, and there was one last terrible eruption still to come. In the summer of 1936, at a racecourse in Sussex, the dying age of the gangs would blaze up one final time in front of thousands of horrified onlookers. The scene would be so shocking and so savage that it would help inspire one of the most famous crime novels ever written, and it would finally bring the curtain down on the whole violent era. Section 10. The Last Great Battle. By 1936, the Great Racecourse War was supposed to be finished. Sabini was bankrupt and aging. The Birmingham boys were gone. The rackets had been strangled by the new pitch rules. On paper, the era of the racecourse gangs had already closed. But the men who had built their whole lives around fear and easy money did not simply retire and slip away quietly. There was one last eruption left in them, and it would be the most public and shocking of the entire war. It happened on the 8th of June 1936 at Lewes Racecourse in Sussex, a little before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A gang of around 30 men had travelled down from London. Every one of them was armed, carrying hammers, hatchets and knuckle dusters. They belonged to a North London outfit known as the Hoxton Mob, and they were led by a fearsome character named Jimmy Spinks. As a strange footnote, Spinks would later be remembered as the great-uncle of Lenny McLean, the bare-knuckle fighter who became famous decades afterward as one of the hardest men in Britain. Hardness, it seems, ran in the family. The Hoxton men had come to Lewes with a clear purpose. They moved through the betting ring with a chilling calm, first walking behind the long row of bookmakers and then back along the front of them, scanning faces, searching for particular people. They were hunting. The man they were hunting is someone you know well by now. It was Alfred Solomon, the very same Alf Solomon who had taken a life at the Eden Club 12 years earlier, the man Sabini had once spent a fortune to protect. The wheel had turned the whole way around. The hunter of 1924 had become the hunted of 1936. Beside Solomon stood his clerk, a man named Mark Frater. When Spinks spotted them, the gang surged forward. Solomon was struck on the head, but somehow tore himself free and vanished into the crowd. His clerk Frater was not so fortunate. As the attackers closed on him, one man pinned his arms while Spinks struck him with a hatchet, and when Frater fell, the rest of the gang set about him where he lay, in front of a packed racecourse full of ordinary families who had come for a pleasant day out. Then, at last, the police arrived. This was the difference between 1936 and 1921. 15 years earlier, a gang could carry out an ambush on a country road and melt away long before the law caught up. By now the authorities were ready, and the response was swift and unforgiving. The arrests came fast, and the courts had run completely out of patience. When the case reached the Lewes Assizes, the judges handed down sentences that would have been unthinkable in the early days of the war. At least 16 of the Hoxton men were convicted, and between them they were sentenced to serve more than 40 years in prison. In one single trial, an entire gang was broken and locked away. This was the sort of justice that had been impossible back when witnesses vanished and cases fell to pieces. The law had finally worked out how to win. There is a remarkable twist buried inside the Lewis story, and it shows just how completely the world had changed. It was said that the attack had been ordered by Alf White, Sabini's former right-hand man, now running his own affairs. And it was said that Darby Sabini himself had been tipped off about the plan beforehand. The old Sabini would have answered with an army of his own. The Sabini of 1936 did something almost unthinkable for a man who had spent his life beating the justice system. He warned his own people to stay well clear of Lewis, and he is said to have passed the warning on to the police. The king, who had once ruled the racecourses by raw force, was now an aging man on the sidelines, quietly stepping out of harm's way, and even helping the law he had spent decades outwitting. Nothing could have announced the end of his reign more plainly. The violence of 1936 was not quite spent, though. A few months later, on the 1st of September, it broke out again, this time at a greyhound stadium in Wandsworth, exactly the kind of dog track the gangs had drifted toward as the horse racing rackets withered. There, in front of thousands of spectators who had come to watch the dogs run, a quarrel between rival men erupted into a fight. Two brothers, Massimino and Camillo Montecolombo, ended up in a savage confrontation with two Clerkenwell men named Bert Marsh and Herbert Wilkins. By the time it was over, Massimino Montecolombo had been fatally wounded with a blade and had lost his life. Marsh and Wilkins were both put on trial over the affair. A man had lost his life in front of an enormous crowd at a place built purely for entertainment. A final, ugly reminder of how casually these men still settled their differences. But Wandsworth was an aftershock, not a fresh beginning. By the end of 1936, the racecourse wars had effectively burned themselves out. The newspapers, which had fed on the story for a decade and a half, simply stopped reporting it because there was almost nothing left to report. The gangs that survived had been broken up, shut away, or pushed off into other corners of crime. The fortune that had been worth fighting over had been regulated clean out of their reach. The era was over. What the war left behind, oddly enough, was a piece of culture that outlived every gangster involved in it. The savagery at Lewis and the whole world of the blade gangs and racecourse protection worked its way into the imagination of a young novelist named Graham Greene. 2 years later, in 1938, Greene published Brighton Rock, a dark crime novel set among exactly these kinds of seaside gangs. One of its central figures, a smooth and dangerous gang boss called Corleone, was modelled in large part on Darby Sabini himself. The man who had spent his life dodging the spotlight ended up captured forever in one of the most famous crime stories in the English language, even if most readers never knew the real history sitting behind it. That is the strange afterlife of this half-forgotten war. Almost nobody today could name Billy Kimber or the Cortese brothers, and yet the world they fought over has echoed quietly through British culture ever since, in novels, in films, and in the legends of the gangs who came after them. These were not glamorous men. They were greedy, frightened, often cruel, and they harmed a great many people who never deserved any of it. But for 15 years they turned the racecourses of England into a battlefield, and the marks they left behind ran far deeper than anyone expected. And that is where the road finally runs out. Darby Sabini, the man who once ruled the racecourses of England, was locked away by his own country during the Second World War, held as an enemy alien purely because of his Italian birth. And he died a few years later in a quiet seaside town, far from the crowds and the cash and the fear that had once been his entire world. Billy Kimber had long since drifted out of the picture and out of the country, his Birmingham empire a memory. The fortune they had spilled so much over simply slipped away to a new and harder generation of London gangsters who would carve up the city all over again in the years after the war. In the end, not one of them kept what he had fought for. They left behind broken men, frightened witnesses, a thick stack of court files, and one dark truth this whole story keeps circling back to. There is no pile of easy money on earth worth what these men paid and forced so many others to pay just to get their hands on it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.